Bonjour tout le monde. As many of you know, I was a blogger on Tumblr long before I ever learned how to make YouTube videos, and most of my audience engagement still comes from over there, despite Tumblr having been an allegedly dead platform for something like 3 years now. Earlier this month, I received this anonymous request, asking me to explain what first got me into Dimidue, the relationship between Dimitri and Dedue in Fire Emblem Three Houses. Now, the appeal of Dimidue is a subject that others have tackled before.
You just want good things for Dedue. Also, you probably have like a 24-page thesis on the racial politics of Three Houses.
Come on, it's not 24 pages, I think. This game's been out for over 2 years. Do you have any idea how much you can write in that time? Whatever. The fact remains, though, that Dimidue is one of those pairings that has a lot of canon material to unpack, especially by the standards of a series that tends to favor quantity over quality when it comes to canon-endorsed or even canon-suggested shipping options. The simplest answer to the question posed to me is basically that I enjoy the analytical bent of looking at queer subtext in media, and that certain Fire Emblem ships are just really good at providing that kind of content. I even made an hour-long video on the subject back in June, and look at who's front and center on the thumbnail. And because I'm far more of a pretentious meta-writer than a creator of fan work, a longer answer to why I ship Dimidue comes from a lot of textual and metatextual analysis instead of just enjoying two big guys being soft with each other. And also that meme about two trucks. As Forsyth of Fire Emblem Echoes is so eager to express, the intimate bonds of military camaraderie are some very well-trod ground in this series. It's little wonder when Fire Emblem is in the business of telling war stories, except you, go away, and when military and wartime settings have always been popular for exploring otherwise transgressive expressions of male homoeroticism, from the sacred band of Thebes to Japanese wakashudo to the rum sodomy and the lash of the British Navy to Pornhub's finest in military fetish content. Fire Emblem, with its cast structured in part around nobility and the people who loyally serve them, blends this with elements of courtly love, a medieval literary tradition that mixes up a knight's devotion to his feudal lord with an adulterous, but ideally never acted upon, attraction to his lord's wife. This subtle, socially transgressive undercurrent carries over into many of the interactions between lords and their subordinates in Fire Emblem, even if courtly love is never referenced expressly as such, especially when the third party is removed for the purposes of simplification. Usually, anyway. And while in current online discourse terms, these types of relationships are sometimes decried for their quote-unquote unhealthy power dynamics, I'm totally down with them. What's a relationship without interesting conflict, right? And while there are a handful of noteworthy straight and even lesbian instances of love between lords and their knights, the prominence of male military camaraderie as a vehicle for queer subtext, and the game's playable cast mostly skewing male, means that most examples of suggestive lord-knight relationships in the series involve two men. About a month before the release of Three Houses, I wrote up a summary piece on the history of these types of relationships in Fire Emblem, many of which would go on to be featured in my queer subtext video. And in the last paragraph, I expressed the hope that we might see something of this nature in the dynamic between Dimitri and Dedue, since pre-release material was not shy about placing Dedue's devotion to his prince front and center. That's a running theme with him, too. His end-card epithet is Taciturn Devotee, while in Heroes he's Dimitri's vassal. Intelligent Systems really wants to make sure we know that Dedue's primary character trait is his devotion to Dimitri, to a degree rarely seen even among other characters of his type. What's more, world-building context on the nation of Fargus sets up this kind of homoromantic bond perfectly, not just for Dimidue, but for the Blue Lions as a whole, or at least the male ones. I have questions about how the chivalric culture that in the real world originated in France works in a fictional nation with a climate and limited resources more reminiscent of Russia. But leaving aside my suspension of disbelief issues, I'm obviously a big fan of all the queer potential. 3 of the 4 paired endings between male lions function in the context of Fargus's martial culture of knighthood, with their interactions filled with talk of emotionally significant battle scars, combat-related PTSD, and, yes, homoerotic death pacts, to the point that all of their paired endings conclude with one or both characters dying. Fargus is a land beset by routine conflict with its northern neighbor Srang, plunged into years of political turmoil following the tragedy of Duscur, and later set against Edelgard's empire in a more traditional Fire Emblem storyline. And the pairings of Dimidue, Dimilix, Dimitri and Felix, and Sylvix, Felix and Sylvain, all reflect the legacy of these conflicts in different ways. The notable exception here is Ashdue, because neither Ash nor Dedue is kingdom nobility, meaning that they're both on the outside looking in at its world of knightly honor. Nonetheless, there's a lot of material to pull from here for fan work, and it's little wonder that all 4 of these ships have a good-sized following in transformative fandom. I've jokingly advanced the idea of what I call Lions OT5, a setup wherein all 4 of the male lions pair endings with one another happen simultaneously, and they all, as friend groups of queer men are wont to do, from time to time pile into the massive royal bed for some long nights of pleasure of a kind those ancient Thebans and their bands of male lovers would be as into as I am. Just imagine that the queen mentioned in the Dimilix ending comes out of future historians frantically attempting to no-homo Dimitri and Dedue cohabitating and probably also adopting 20 war orphans, because you can't tell me that wouldn't be a thing with those two. One of them can even be Dimitri's heir, the prince mentioned in some of Gilbert's endings that some people try to use as a cheap gotcha against Dimitri's queerness. Because we all know the only way to have kids is biological reproduction, and that Dimitri never criticizes Fargus's crest-based inheritance system, right? Getting back on topic, another lens through which I can appreciate Dimidue is in the ship's natural foil, Dimilix. I admit that I'm not a huge fan of angsty swordsmen, and that Felix's character and arc don't do a lot for me personally, but there's no denying that the push and pull between him and Dedue factors significantly into Dimitri's character development, and into the emotional thrust of Azure Moon, minus a certain intrusive player self-insert stealing screen time from them both, that is. It's clear from the outset that they're both important to Dimitri and to each other. The first you see of either character in-game is them double-teaming Dimitri, and that they care deeply about the prince but also go about showing that care in very different ways. The Dimilix relationship is far more fraught, with Felix struggling to process his grief over the death of his brother, chafing against his father's own grief-induced missteps in typical angsty teenager fashion, and appalled by his childhood friend's trauma-induced violent episodes. It takes the full length of Azure Moon and a lot of uncomfortable growth for both of them to reconcile. And while their relationship is for most of the game's run the more abrasive and unhealthy of the two, Dimitri's relationship with Dedue has its issues too. The two of them met when Dimitri saved Dedue's life during the genocide of the Duscur people, and they've been bound together by the weight of their individual traumas for years before the game begins, which understandably gives their dynamic a mutually codependent vibe. Dimitri begins to chafe against Dedue's excess of concern late in Part 1 as the events of the plot take their toll on his mental state, but as near as can be pieced together from context, it's Dedue apparently sacrificing himself for Dimitri and forcing him to live on the run alone for nearly 5 years that triggers Dimitri's full psychotic break. By context here, I largely mean the game outside Azure Moon, because it's worth noting that the other routes add more layers to Dimitri's relationships with both Dedue and Felix. Felix can be recruited to other houses, and if he is, it's evident from his all-around sadder endings and the way that he turns into the same kind of bloodthirsty killer that he hated in Dimitri, that Felix's act of teenage rebellion against his father and his childhood friend have left him deeply unhappy. On the other hand, Dedue being ineligible for cross-house recruitment might negatively impact his tier placement for 100% completion, but it also solidifies his relationship with Dimitri outside their own route. They essentially have 3 more endings aside from the one they can get in Azure Moon via the standard support system. In Verdant Wind, Dimitri, still raging and consumed by vengeance, demands that Dedue live on after their defeat at Gronder Field, paralleling their reunion scene in Azure Moon, where even before his big character development, Dimitri shows that he values Dedue's life more than anyone else's up to and including his own. This leads into Dedue declaring after Dimitri's death that he'll avenge his fallen prince, and in both that route and Silver Snow, he infiltrates Enbar all on his own with the intention of taking Edelgard's head, and, if he survives, this conscientious ginger warlock back at the monastery informs us that Dedue went off alone in a move that could be read as a tragic callback to Finn's ending in Thracia 776, another man devoted to his slain lord and determined to seek an ultimately hollow vengeance. Silver Snow additionally floats the possibility that Dimitri may actually have survived Gronder via this weird cutscene where he may or may not be a ghost who believes, incorrectly, that Dedue is dead, which for me at least leaves open the scenario of Dimitri and Dedue finding one another again in some remote corner of Fodlan after the game ends. Then in Crimson Flower, we see how Dimitri would have fared if he hadn't been separated from Dedue during the time skip. He is literally and figuratively clear-sighted. Dedue hides from Dimitri his plan to steal Creststones from the Royal Vault to have him and other soldiers transform into demonic beasts as a last act of desperation. And while Dimitri is deeply saddened by this, he resolves nonetheless to fight at Dedue's side. I just love how the wording here inverts their usual dynamic. It's great. But then, if you can get to Dedue fast enough and defeat him before he transforms, you get this scene.
Your Majesty. Your Majesty! Stop calling me that. Oh, thank the... No!
I just have so many feelings. The continued bickering over forms of address, Dedue comforting Dimitri by saying that their relationship means more than avenging the fallen, Dimitri dying with a smile on his face, the fact that this scene replaces the one of Edelgard executing Dimitri while insulting him and misunderstanding his motivations as usual. It's an absolute travesty that this scene isn't in the event gallery, and that so few people even seem to know it exists. Best scene of Crimson Flower that doesn't involve Hubert, hands down. Just, God, I love this. Speaking of Hubert, his and Dedue's status as root-locked retainers also sparks some interesting contrast between the two, as men unflinchingly devoted to their leaders while also being as in love with said leaders as they can possibly be after accounting for Dimidue needing plausible no-homo deniability, and Hubert's feelings for Edelgard running a distant second to certain other concerns. Hubert never refers to Edelgard without an honorific, even when professing his love, but as any Dimidue shipper will tell you, Dedue calls Dimitri by his name exactly twice, once before transforming in Crimson Flower, and once in their A support while blushing. In combination with both characters' typical emotional reserve, this causes the Edelbert dynamic to come off as more coldly professional, even though they don't have to worry about the massive stumbling block of explicit queerness. And this is reflected in the pairing's respective endings. Dimitri takes no queen in his ending with Dedue, and Dedue is posthumously rewarded with a burial worthy of a royal consort, indicating that, no matter how much they might have tried to keep it in the closet, the entire kingdom wasn't buying it. Meanwhile, Edelgard and Hubert don't get married, even though she will marry a handful of other men. Although this is in large part because she only has eyes for someone else, which brings me to... I'm being honest here when I say that I'm not approaching this from a position of ship bashing. That's already complicated in this instance because Byleth, more so than any previous Fire Emblem avatar, is a player self-insert first and a character second, which makes all of their ships awkward to compare to ships that don't involve them, but the relationship between Byleth and Edelgard lies in a class of its own. The opposition between an avatar and lord was the original concept for Three Houses after all. And as you play through it on any route, it becomes painfully obvious that the player is supposed to regard Edeleth as something of an emotional core for the game as a whole. Edelgard is always fixated on Byleth, no matter their gender or the route, and dialogue options outside of Crimson Flower suggest that Byleth is still attracted to her, or at least sympathetic to her, regardless of everything she's done. Even the Eagle's route split is framed not in rational or ideological terms, but in an emotional appeal to how Byleth, or rather the player, feels about Edelgard. Needless to say, this is rather grating for someone like me who's not attracted to women, and leaves me very uncharitable toward Byleth as a self-insert fantasy in general. But let's step back a bit and look at the bigger picture of subtext versus Avatar S-ranks. Three Houses is in fact the first Fire Emblem game to blend these two concepts so thoroughly. Awakening and Fates introduced S-ranks along with Avatar dating sim mechanics, but also dialed back on serious considerations of queer subtext, the kind that had been prolific in the GBA and Tellius games and that have since been explored again in the Avatar-free Shadows of Valentia. I distinctly recall the month and a half between E3 2019 and Three Houses' release in late July, when data miners were frantically trying to discover who Byleth could S-rank. This was around the time that fans were convinced that Claude was a buy option because his smile is striking and he takes Byleth's hand at the ball, and outraged that Gilbert and Alois were platonic S-rank options, and speculating that Rhea and Sothis were playable because Byleth could S-rank them. Even at the time, when I wasn't fully aware that Byleth was a silent protagonist with no personality, I just couldn't get invested in these conversations, and I was far more interested in which same-sex pairs had A ranks and paired endings, because echoes and the bits of information we'd gotten in pre-release led me to hope that at least some of them would turn out some meaningful subtext. I even drew up a list on my blog of predictions for the male same-sex A ranks, where I'm pleased to note that I called all the Lions boys and would eventually be rewarded with my curiosity over Hubert and Ferdinand. Linhardt and Caspar and the Golden Deer boys, not so much, but you can't have them all. And while I don't mean to discount the wealth of other pairings with strong subtext, including well-developed sapphic relationships like Dorothea's multiple options, or the love triangle of Rhea, Catherine, and Shamir, I do think that Dimidue stands out by its sheer volume of content for a same-sex pairing, arguably to a degree surpassed only by Edeleth. Canon did not have to go as hard as it does with Dimidue, but it does, to the point that I feel comfortable pitting it against Byleth's most canon-endorsed pairing. Because Byleth is a self-insert, Edeleth is scripted more like romances from most actual dating sims. It is parasocial by nature, and depends heavily on what, if anything, the player is willing to invest in it. This stands in stark contrast to Dimidue, a pairing that in large part is out of the player's direct control, and it really shows. The two of them have been doing their codependent trauma bonding thing for 4 years before the game even starts, and their supports aren't about building new bonds so much as hammering out the specific parameters of their relationship and how much they feel comfortable with sharing with the general public. Outside of Azure Moon, Dimitri and Dedue are unquestionably the most important people in each other's lives, and while the player can help Dedue achieve vengeance or give the two of them a more dignified and intimate death, there's no way via Byleth to disrupt their bond. Sucks to be Felix, or Ash for that matter, but that's cross-house recruitment for you. In Azure Moon, the contrast is even more stark. Dedue is notoriously killed off by default during the time skip, and while this does awful things to his characterization in the latter half of his own route, I can't help but see it as a testament to the significance of his relationship with Dimitri. It's as if the writers scripted this deeply intimate homoromantic bond between a lord and his sworn man, a culmination of decades of similar relationships in past games, and then realized later in development that the Avatar was contractually obligated to be able to bang both of them. So they made Dedue's survival into Part 2 dependent on a paralogue and shafted Dimitri's entire support network when it came to writing the fulfillment of his character arc, so that they could clumsily shove Byleth in there instead. And if you play as male Byleth, it's all for nothing in the end, because they don't get an S rank or a paired ending. It's also telling that Dedue's ending with Byleth is the only one he has where he leaves Dimitri, making it ring wildly out of character for him, but also emphasizing that yeah, Byleth has been inorganically shoved in between them. Unless you want to read liberally into her Dorothea supports or acknowledge that her suggested paired ending with Manuela exists, Edelgard's canon queerness depends entirely on the self-insert, whereas Dimidue succeeds despite the self-insert. Dimitri and Dedue truly are till death or the player do them part. I acknowledge that to an extent, which of these two approaches to queer content you prefer depends on personal taste, and also that if I were more fair regarding my own interest, I'd be putting Dimidue up against Byheart or Irreplaceable or, God help me, Bylitza. But all of those pairings lack any real heft outside of their supports, and unless you count Irreplaceable and Cindered Shadows, they have nothing at all resembling the story presence of either Edeleth or Dimidue. This is just more of the same message I've been pushing since those uncertain pre-release days. Don't mistake Avatar S ranks as the be-all end-all of Fire Emblem queer content. You're doing yourself a disservice if you're interested in that sort of thing, and it also makes conversations surrounding the series' alleged progressivism rather awkward when you're only getting half the picture. But I feel like I'm getting a little too heavy here. Let's do some squeeing. It's not an exaggeration to say that much of the appeal of Dimitri and Dedue is how much they're not what you'd expect at first glance. Here are two of the physically largest men in the cast, defined like most of the Lions by so much backstory violence and trauma that it had to become a substantial element of every Roots Part 1, and yet their actual relationship is so tender, so doting, and indeed, so very soft. They have goofy lines that have been turned into memes. Dimitri is intimately familiar with Dedue's small changes in facial expression, and he hides his inability to taste food from Dedue because he wants to make Dedue smile. Dedue is intimately familiar with Dimitri's sleeping habits, and their C support implies that they used to bathe together, maybe? Their A support opens with a line implying that they're having this conversation in a state of undress, and ends with Dimitri lightheartedly accepting that Dedue is always going to dote on him. Dedue wants to distract Dimitri from his workload and favors an answer that essentially amounts to taking him out on a date, although somebody might have had a little BDSM in mind there too with one of those other options, just saying. Just because they're soft doesn't mean they can't be kinky, right? An NPC outright compares Dedue to a bear, making my job in categorizing his gay appeal very easy, and also prompting a cute fan event taking that idea in a more safe-for-work direction. Their softness extends outward to Azure Moon as well, as the root emphasizes themes like community, personal responsibility, and choosing forgiveness over vengeance. I think the ending tapestry scene of the root says it all, showing Dimitri playing with children while a man of Duscur, who clearly would have been Dedue if he weren't killed off by default, looks on. It's just so soft. Also, Irreplaceable, Cherished. Is there anything closer to a full-on romantic declaration between male characters anywhere else in this game? Oh wait, there is. And even aside from just being broadly adorable, there's some real conceptual meat to Dimidue positivity. The pairing could be best summarized as two people making the best of a terrible situation, leaning on each other to pull themselves out of their grief and loss. Far from being an unhealthy power dynamic, theirs is a relationship that repeatedly negotiates that dynamic to reach understanding. Right from their C support, Dimitri makes it clear that he privately does not consider Dedue to be his vassal and wants the two of them to be on equal terms, and it's Dedue who pulls back out of concern for Dimitri's reputation given the tense relations between Fargus and Duscur. Not only is this arguably the most blatantly queer-coded exchange in all of Three Houses, with two men disagreeing over how public their relationship should be, and with said relationship damaging one man's pre-existing relationships, that it also leads into Dimitri revealing that he feels personally responsible for the genocide of the Duscur people, and is determined to set things right, which they go on to do in their ending, how about that? Far from being a white savior dynamic, or any of the other bad faith criticisms of this pairing propagated via Twitter outrage, this is more of the emphasis on understanding and community that props up Azure Moon, giving Dedue space to admit that he hates Fargus but loves Dimitri more, and allowing Dimitri the chance to do the right thing and make up for the kingdom's crimes once he takes the throne. This is the point of Dedue's paralogue, where the two of them intervene in a doomed rebellion by Duscur soldiers against the kingdom, defeating them and forcing them to retreat before the kingdom army can kill them, and ending with Dedue expressing his absolute faith in Dimitri to restore his homeland. Duscur itself may be as thinly sketched as periphery nations in Fire Emblem always are, and Dedue isn't allowed to participate in the late-game resolution to the Duscur plotline because he's killed off by default, but, again, this is the two of them making the best of a bad situation. It's actually kind of beautiful that, with the odds and even the demands of self-insert romance stacked against him, the son of a blacksmith and a survivor of genocide could become the beloved companion of a king, and even be buried beside him. And alongside the male lion's other paired endings, and other bits like the dynamic between Lambert and Rodrigue, and the mythicized bond of Fargus's first king Lug and his close friend Kaifon, we can piece together a solid picture of what intimacy between men looks like and means to the culture of the kingdom. That wraps the whole thing back around to those historical examples of soldierly camaraderie, of course, but it's also a vastly more cohesive bit of queer world-building than is present anywhere else in Three Houses. While I also adore the relationship between Hubert and Ferdinand with its potential for campy, murderous melodrama, the same-sex relationships between Adrestian characters lack any sort of thematic through line, except perhaps a connection to the theater shared by Dorothea, Manuela, and to a lesser extent Ferdinand. Manuela may be a drag act waiting to happen, and Ferdinand may be just the queen to pull it off, and the Ferdibert dynamic has provided ample fodder for AUs, from Jane Austen to James Bond, with a ton of Broadway in addition. But as entertaining as it all can be, it is telling that although the Eagles are the internet-declared gay house, their associated same-sex pairings are practically all islands unto themselves that do some of their best work in AUs based on other media. I am, it must be said, grateful that, unlike its predecessor Shadows of Valentia, Three Houses provides just enough connective tissue between the manly military romances of Fargus and the theatricality of Ferdibert to make it feasible that they'd actually exist in the same universe, and that together they offer a more rounded presentation of male queerness in this setting than either one of them alone. I have to say that's worth something coming from a Fire Emblem game that sells itself in part on the strength of its world building beyond any previous game in the series, even when that world building's still riddled with holes and overstuffed with so much extraneous NPC chatter that you sometimes feel like you're playing an open world game with only one location. Oh well, never said it was a perfect game. That's going to wrap it up for me sharing my love for a pairing that could always use a little more. Shipping fandom can be a strange thing to participate in when you're more of an analytical meta-writing sort, but Fire Emblem is one of those media properties where I can often have my cake and eat it too, as it were, even with a game as divisive and wank-inducing as Three Houses. Leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and be sure to check out my Patreon if you'd like to support my content both here on my channel and elsewhere. Fellow Dimidue shippers, I want to hear from you in the comments. What got you into this pairing, and what do you like most about it? And for everyone else, how'd you feel about me putting together what's basically a shipping manifesto video? Should I do it with any other pairings? Tell me about it in the comments. Au revoir!